Each encounter holds a hidden truth. Every investigation demands clarity. Empowering your legal rights, uncovering pure justice.
We got a call. You need to come with us for verification.
You need to leave. You have no warrant to be here.
I am recording this. Get your hands off him. That's assault.
Two ICE agents believed they held absolute authority. They possessed an address. An anonymous tip phoned in from a prepaid cell.
It was just past 6 a.m. when the pounding on the door broke the silence of that suburban home. Not ordinary knocking, the kind of pounding that does not ask permission, does not wait for an answer, that already communicates before a single word is spoken, that whoever is on the other side did not come to talk. The man who walked to the door was still in his sleep clothes. He had not had coffee. He had not had time to process anything. And when he opened the door and found himself facing ICE agents in tactical vests carrying the energy of people who had arrived to execute an operation, the first thing he did was something none of them expected. He asked to see the warrant. There was no warrant. And what happened in the minutes that followed, inside that house, was recorded. The camera captured everything with a clarity that left no room for alternative versions, for misunderstandings, for defense narratives constructed after the fact. It was all there, agents entering without legal authorization, hands being placed on a man who had committed no crime, the verbal resistance of someone who knew his rights and refused to surrender them, even with federal agents standing inside his own living room. The video began circulating before the sun had even fully risen that morning. The man being physically grabbed by an ICE agent inside his own home was named Marcus. And Marcus was not an ordinary citizen without resources, without knowledge, without anyone to call. Marcus was a chief of police. He had spent decades in public safety, had built an entire career within the structures of the very system now being used against him, and knew the law with the intimacy of someone who applies it every day. The irony of that moment, a police chief being physically restrained by federal agents without a warrant inside his own home, was so brutal that the first people who saw the video thought it was staged. It was not. It was completely real. And what made that situation even more explosive was the sequence of events that followed in the hours, days, and weeks after that morning, because the agents who entered that house without a warrant, who put their hands on Marcus without legal justification, who ignored every protocol they themselves were required to follow, had failed to calculate one fundamental thing: that the person they were approaching knew exactly what they were doing wrong, knew exactly how to document it, and had precisely the contacts necessary to ensure that no one would forget. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story gets more intense with every section, and you are going to want to follow it all the way to the end. Before we continue, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you believe this could happen to anyone, or does it only happen to certain people? Tell me down below, because that question matters deeply to what this story is about to reveal. The video from that morning became one of the most watched and most discussed recordings in the debate about federal abuse of power in the United States during that period. Not because it was the only case of ICE agents entering homes without a warrant, but because this time the person on the other side of the operation had a name, had a title, had decades of documented public service, and had a camera recording every second. And because when everything was over, the careers that were destroyed did not belong to the man being grabbed. They belonged to the ones doing the grabbing. Marcus had arrived in that city nearly 20 years before. He came young, with a criminal justice degree in hand, and a quiet determination that the people around him took a little time to recognize, but that never disappeared. He had started at the bottom, like any other officer, working night shifts in difficult neighborhoods, learning in practice what no classroom can fully teach about what it means to stand between the law and chaos. He had risen slowly, without shortcuts, accumulating respect in the way that can only be built through time and consistency. And when he was appointed chief of police, it had been unanimously the kind of decision that happens when no one in the room has a legitimate argument against it. The house where Marcus lived was the house he and his wife had bought 16 years earlier, when the neighborhood was still developing and the lots were more affordable. They had renovated slowly over the years, one room at a time, the way middle-class families build. There's spaces when there is no money to spare, but there is enough patience. It was an ordinary house, American suburb, with a lawn in the front and a 2-car garage. The kind of house that draws no attention, that blends in with the others on the street, that exists simply as the place where a family sleeps, eats, and begins and ends its days. There was nothing in that house that justified what happened that morning. ICE had received a tip. That was the official starting point of the entire operation. An anonymous report alleging that an undocumented individual was residing at that address. This kind of tip arrives by the thousands every month to immigration agencies, and the vast majority of them are investigated with some level of due diligence before any action is taken. There is a protocol. There is a verification chain. There is, above all, the constitutional requirement that federal agents obtain a judicial warrant before entering a private residence, unless there is an immediate and documentable emergency justifying warrantless entry. None of that was followed that morning. What the agents who arrived at that house at 6 in the morning did not know, or did not bother to verify, was the identity of the resident. A basic search in the system, the kind of check that takes literally minutes, would have immediately revealed that the address was registered in Marcus's name, that Marcus was an American citizen born in that state, and that Marcus held the highest position in the city's police hierarchy. That verification was either not done, or it was done and ignored, and neither possibility is less serious than the other. Because if it was not done, it reveals an operational negligence that puts any citizen at risk who has the misfortune of being targeted by an anonymous tip. And if it was done and ignored, the problem is far more serious than negligence. The team that knocked on that door consisted of 4 agents, all uniformed, all in tactical vests with the ICE acronym in yellow letters on the back, all carrying the posture of people who had been briefed for a containment operation and not for a verification visit. When Marcus opened the door and asked to see the warrant, the response he received was not a legal explanation. It was pressure. The agents pushed forward, and when Marcus did not step back, when he held his ground at his own threshold and kept demanding legal documentation, one of the agents put his hands on him and attempted to push him further inside the house. That was the moment the camera captured most clearly. That was the moment that destroyed careers. What the agents did not know, as that entire scene unfolded in Marcus's living room, was that the person recording was not just a frightened family member trying to document an abuse out of instinct. It was Marcus's wife, a woman who had been married to a police chief for nearly 2 decades and who knew, with a precision that came from years of living alongside security, protocols, exactly what needed to be captured in that video for it to be useful afterward. She kept the camera steady. She made sure the agents' faces were visible. She made sure the interior of the house was visible, proving that the entry had occurred without authorization inside a private residence. Every second of that recording was, without the agents realizing it, evidence being built against them. The video lasted just under 4 minutes. 4 minutes that contained enough to end careers, open federal investigations, and put the name of that operation in the headlines of news outlets that the agents involved had probably never imagined would be covering a case like theirs. Marcus had been released that same morning after one of the agents finally ran the check that should have been done before anyone knocked on that door and discovered, with an embarrassing swiftness, exactly who the man was that they had just grabbed inside his own home. The operation was closed without any arrest, without any evidence of immigration irregularity, and with 4 federal agents walking out of that house in silence, knowing they had made a mistake whose dimensions were still becoming clear. Marcus did not spend the rest of that morning trying to emotionally recover from what had happened, though anyone in his position would have had every right to do so. He spent that morning on the phone. He called his personal attorney first, then the legal counsel of the police department, then 2 contacts he had built over decades of work in public safety who had direct access to federal oversight bodies. Each call was made with the same methodical calm Marcus had developed over years of handling crises. He was not panicking. He was building, brick by brick, the structure of a response that went far beyond a formal complaint. The video was sent to the attorney that same morning, accompanied by a written document prepared by Marcus's wife, detailing the exact sequence of events from the first sound of the pounding on the door to the moment the agents left. She had noted the times, had described each agent's appearance with enough detail for identification, had recorded every word she had heard clearly enough to be quoted. The document was 6 pages long. It was the kind of account that attorneys spend years trying to obtain from clients and rarely receive with that level of precision and detail. Marcus's wife had produced it in under 2 hours, while the memory of the agents was still fresh and her hands were still slightly trembling. When the attorney watched the video for the first time, He did something experienced lawyers rarely do right away. He said, without hesitation, that it was one of the clearest cases of Fourth Amendment violation he had seen in years of practice. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution protects citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures, and requires that government agents obtain a warrant based on probable cause before entering a private residence. There was no warrant. There was no documented probable cause. There was none of the emergency conditions that the law recognizes as justification for entry without judicial authorization. There were only 4 federal agents who had decided, for reasons they would have to explain under oath, that the rules did not apply that morning. The question Marcus's attorney began investigating immediately was not just what had happened, but why it had happened. The anonymous tip was the official starting point, but anonymous tips arrive every day and do not result in tactical pre-dawn operations without prior identity verification. Something had failed in the chain of command that authorized that operation, and identifying exactly where that failure had occurred was fundamental to determining the scope of legal responsibility. Because in cases like this one, responsibility rarely ends with the agents who knocked on the door. It travels up the hierarchy until it reaches whoever approved the operation, without ensuring that minimum protocols had been followed. The video leaked to the press before any official investigation was announced. It remains unclear exactly how that happened, whether it was a strategic decision by Marcus's legal team, whether it was someone within the oversight structures who felt the public had a right to know, or whether it was simply the inevitable result of a video of that impact existing on multiple devices simultaneously. What is clear is the effect the leak produced. In less than 24 hours, those images of an ICE agent with his hands on a black chief of police inside his own living room had been seen by millions of people, and the reaction was not one of disbelief. It was one of recognition. The quiet, heavy kind of recognition that comes when something you already knew was happening is confirmed on screen with unusual clarity. The official investigation was announced 48 hours after the video leaked. It was not a voluntary decision by the agency. It was a response to pressure, the kind of institutional movement that happens when silence starts costing more than transparency. The ICE Internal Oversight Office released a brief statement confirming it was aware of the incident and that a review of operational procedures was being conducted. The statement did not mention Marcus by name. It acknowledged no error. It contained no word of apology or recognition of what had been done. It was the kind of institutional communiqué designed to look like a response without actually being one, the kind that experienced attorneys read in 30 seconds and immediately understand means the battle will be long. Marcus's legal team had anticipated exactly that response. They had already prepared the filing of a federal lawsuit even before the official statement was released, working in the hours following the video. Leak with a speed that is only possible when you have absolute clarity about the strength of what is in your hands. The lawsuit was officially filed in federal court 3 days after the incident, naming all 4 agents individually, the supervisor who had authorized the operation, and the agency itself as an institution responsible for the systemic failure that had made that morning possible. It was a dense document, technically precise, and constructed in a way that closed each of the exits the defense typically uses to create doubt in cases of federal misconduct. What made this lawsuit particularly difficult to defend from the agency's standpoint was the combination of elements that rarely appear together in a single case. There was the video, which was irrefutable. There was Marcus's impeccable record, which eliminated any attempt to construct an alternative narrative about who he was or what he had done to deserve that approach. There was the complete absence of a warrant, which transformed the agent's entry into a clear and documented constitutional violation. And there was the fact that the anonymous tip that had started everything had never been verified by any means before the operation was authorized, which meant that protocol had been ignored, not by a single agent acting on his own, but by an entire chain of decisions that would need to be explained. The 4 agents were removed from operational duties during the investigation. That removal was officially presented as a standard administrative measure, the kind of thing that happens automatically while facts are being established. But everyone who understands how these structures work knew that suspension during a federal investigation, in cases with video evidence, rarely ends with a return to service. The agents hired private attorneys, separate from the lawyer the agency had designated to represent institutional interests. which was itself a clear signal that they understood their interests, and the agencies were not necessarily the same. Each began constructing their own version of events, and the versions were not consistent with each other. The supervisor who had authorized the operation was a man named Reeves, with 15 years of service and a record that, when it began to be scrutinized by the investigation, revealed a pattern that no one inside the agency claimed not to have seen before, but that no one had ever formally documented. There were other operations authorized by Reeves with insufficient identity verification. There were other residential entries with questionable warrant documentation. There were filed complaints that had never been seriously investigated, the kind of history that exists in silence within institutions until a case large enough forces everyone to look at it. Marcus's case was large enough, and Reeves's record was now being examined by investigators who had no interest in protecting him. Public pressure kept growing while all of this was happening behind the scenes. Civil rights organizations had formally entered the case as interested parties. Legislators from both parties had made public statements demanding explanations, which in a political climate normally divided on immigration issues was itself revealing about how indefensible that specific operation had been. It was not possible to frame what had happened as a matter of immigration policy, because what had happened had nothing to do with immigration. It had to do with 4 federal agents entering an American citizen's home without a warrant, placing their hands on him without legal justification, and only backing down when they discovered who he was. That was the case. And that case had no political side. It had only one legal side, and that side was completely clear. The depositions began 6 weeks after the federal lawsuit was filed. This is the moment in a legal battle where the narratives constructed by defense attorneys meet the reality of questions asked under oath, and where the distance between what was said publicly and what actually happened frequently begins to collapse in ways that no communication strategy can contain. The 4 agents were deposed separately, in a deliberate sequence that Marcus's team had planned carefully, beginning with the agent who had placed his hands on him and progressing through the chain of command until reaching Reeves. Each deposition created a record that the next one needed to be consistent with, and consistency was exactly what that chain of command could not produce. The first agent to be deposed spent 3 hours answering questions about the events of that morning. His initial version was the rehearsed one, that the operation had followed protocol, that entry into the residence had been voluntary on the part of the resident, and that the force used had been minimal and justified by the resistance encountered. Each of those points was then confronted with the video, frame by frame, second by second. Marcus's attorney had prepared a detailed technical analysis of every moment in the recording, with precise timestamps and objective descriptions of what was happening in each frame. When the agent's version and what the video showed diverged, which happened repeatedly, the attorney simply stopped, pointed to the specific timestamp, and let the silence do the work. The second agent contradicted the first on 3 fundamental points. Not dramatically, not in a way that seemed intentional, but in the way contradictions emerge when 2 people are trying to recall a version of events that does not correspond to what actually happened. Small differences in sequence, discrepancies about who had made which decision and at what moment, incompatible versions of what had been said before entry into the residence. Each contradiction was documented by Marcus's attorneys with the quiet precision of people who knew they were building something that would be very difficult to dismantle later. The third and fourth agents deepened the contradictions rather than resolving them. Reeves was the last to be deposed. He arrived with 2 attorneys, one designated by the agency and one he had hired privately at his own expense, which communicated before any word was spoken that he understood the gravity of his position. His answers were carefully calibrated, the kind of testimony that is clearly the product of many hours of preparation with experienced lawyers. He acknowledged that he had authorized the operation. He stated that he had relied on the information provided by the team that had received the tip. He denied having known that the identity verification protocols had not been followed, and when confronted with the history of other operations with questionable documentation, he responded that each case had been handled according to the information available at the time, a phrase designed to sound reasonable while admitting nothing. What Reeves had not calculated was the volume of internal documentation that Marcus's team had obtained through formal public records requests, internal emails, operational reports, communication records between the agents and the supervisor in the hours before the operation. This material had been requested through the legal mechanisms available in this type of proceeding, and the agency had attempted to block part of the access by citing operational security concerns. The judge overseeing the case had rejected most of the blocks, determining that procedural transparency prevailed over institutional objections when there was prima facie evidence of constitutional rights violations. The material that reached Marcus's attorneys contained enough to transform what was already a solid case into something the agency simply could not. Defend in a public trial, settlement negotiations began discreetly, through indirect channels before the depositions were even fully completed. This is always the signal that the party being sued recognizes, at some level, its attorneys are not yet authorized to admit publicly, that a trial would be worse than any agreement that could be negotiated now. The agency had an interest in avoiding a trial for reasons that went far beyond Marcus's specific case. A public trial, with that video as the central evidence, with the contradictions between the agent's testimonies exposed before a jury, with Reeves's history being presented in detail, would create a precedent and a public record that would affect the agency far beyond that one case. Marcus knew this. His attorneys knew this. And they had no interest in facilitating an exit that did not fully reflect what had been done. The agreement was announced on a Thursday morning, 4.5 months after that 6 o'clock operation that had started everything. The figures were substantial, the kind of amount that federal agencies rarely agree to pay without a very clear awareness that the alternative would be worse. But Marcus had made it clear from the beginning, through his attorneys and at every moment of the negotiations, that money was not the center of what he was seeking. He had spent decades building a career dedicated to the idea that the law applies equally to everyone, that no one is above the protocols that exist to protect citizens from abuses of power, and that accountability is not optional when there is sufficient evidence that something wrong was done. He was not willing to accept an agreement that did not reflect that idea in a concrete and permanent way. The non-financial conditions of the agreement were, in many respects, more significant than the amount paid. The 4 agents involved in the operation were dismissed from the agency with no possibility of rehire in any federal law enforcement capacity. Reeves lost not only his job, but the certification he had accumulated over 15 years, which in practice ended any possibility of continuing a career in public safety at any level. The agency was required to implement a revised identity verification protocol before any residential operation, with multiple levels of confirmation that needed to be documented before any authorization could be granted. And Marcus's case was formally incorporated into the mandatory training material for new agents, not as an abstract example of what not to do, but as a specific case with names, faces, and real consequences. Marcus held a press conference the day after the agreement was announced. He appeared in uniform, which was a deliberate and meaningful choice. He was there not only as the victim of that specific incident, but as the chief of police of that city, representing an institution that had as much interest as any citizen in ensuring that federal agents operated within the boundaries of the law. He spoke for just over 10 minutes, without notes, without a teleprompter, with the direct clarity of someone who had thought deeply about what he wanted to say and had arrived at the essential. He said the agreement was not a personal victory. It was an obligation fulfilled. What Marcus said at that press conference about the video continued to be quoted in the weeks that followed in discussions about transparency and accountability in federal operations. He observed that the recording his wife had made that morning had not changed what had happened. The agents had still entered without a warrant. Hands had still been placed on him without legal justification. The abuse had still occurred. What the video had done was make it impossible to deny that it had occurred, and that distinction between what happens and what can be proven to have happened was the center of everything. Because without that recording, the agency's version would likely have prevailed, as it prevails in countless cases, where there is no camera, no witnesses with sufficient credibility, and no one with the resources necessary to sustain a legal battle against a federal agency. The dismissed agents disappeared from public view with a speed that contrasted with the impact the case had caused. There were no statements, no interviews, no public attempt to present an alternative side of the story. Their attorneys had clearly advised them that silence was the only reasonable strategy available, and they followed that advice. Reeves attempted, through the union representing federal agents, to reverse part of the conditions of his dismissal, arguing he had been treated disproportionately for a decision made in good faith with the information available. The argument did not survive the first levels of review. The information available had included a functioning camera near the neighboring community mailboxes and a federal database with Marcus's name and title 1 click away. Good faith had a very clear limit there. What this case left as a permanent record goes beyond the careers ended and the settlement paid. It entered the legal literature on Fourth Amendment violations in immigration operations. It was cited in congressional hearings on federal agency oversight. It became one of the most referenced examples in discussions about what happens when power meets no informed resistance, when people who should know the law decide it does not apply to them in that specific moment, and when the only thing separating impunity from consequence is a camera in the right hands. Marcus returned to work. The department he led continued to function, and in that suburban home where everything had begun at 6 a.m. on an ordinary day, life moved forward with the quiet awareness that things could have ended completely differently if any one of the elements of that specific equation had been different. That awareness, uncomfortable and necessary, is probably the most important thing this case produced.
Excuse me, what exactly are you doing in this neighborhood?
I'm sorry, what? I'm just walking to my car.
Don't act dumb. This is a private community and I know you don't belong here.
Ma'am, this is a public street. I live 3 houses down from here.
I'm calling the police. You are way too
You're
suspicious.
free to call whoever you...
It was a quiet Saturday morning in the neighborhood. The kind of morning where the silence of residential streets is only broken by the wind carrying autumn leaves across the sidewalk. Cars sat in driveways, houses were still, and everything had that deceptive appearance of a place where absolutely nothing could go wrong. It was October 14th, 2023, exactly 11:23 in the morning, and a security camera installed near the community mailboxes was recording everything in high definition, with no one around yet understanding the weight that footage would carry in the weeks to come. Diana had just returned from a yoga class. She was in workout clothes, carrying her rolled purple mat tucked under her arm, and was heading to the mailboxes the way she did every week. There was nothing extraordinary about that moment. She lived there, paid her HOA fees on time, and had the key to the box with her own house number engraved on it. She was a resident like any other in that neighborhood. But when a neighbor appeared, a blonde woman in a denim jacket with her arms crossed and an expression that left little room for ambiguity, what should have been an ordinary morning turned into something neither of them would ever forget. The neighbor approached with the posture of someone who had already made up her mind before she even opened her mouth. There was no friendliness, no casual greeting that you'd expect between people who had shared the same neighborhood for months. There was only that tense, accusatory energy, the kind that any black person who has ever lived in a predominantly white space recognizes immediately. It doesn't need to be spoken out loud. It lives in the body, in the gaze, in the way someone treats you as though you need to justify your presence in a particular place simply by existing there. Diana knew that energy. She had felt it before. And she understood, in that exact moment, that she needed to choose very carefully how she was going to respond. What the neighbor didn't know, and this is the detail that changes everything in this story, is that Diana wasn't just a resident of the neighborhood. Diana was a lawyer, not just any lawyer. She was a specialist in real estate law, a field that deals precisely with property, ownership, housing rights, and everything surrounding the legal space a person has the right to occupy. In other words, the woman being questioned about whether she actually lived there spent her weekdays defending other people's rights to their own properties. The irony was almost impossible to believe. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. This story gets far more intense than these first few minutes suggest, and you are going to want to stay until the end. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments if you have ever been through something like this. If you have ever been treated as though you didn't belong somewhere, you had every right to be. It could be a neighborhood, a store, a hotel, a restaurant. Tell me down below, because this conversation matters. The security camera kept recording as the two women stood there on the sidewalk near the mailboxes, autumn leaves behind them and the cloudy October sky above. Within minutes, that footage would stop being just a file in a residential monitoring system and become evidence. Evidence of something that happens with alarming frequency in neighborhoods, shopping centers, elevators, and streets across the country, but that is rarely captured with such clarity. And when that video reached the right hands, the life of one of those two women on that sidewalk would never be the same again. Diana grew up understanding that competence was not enough, that diplomas on the wall were not enough, that an address in a good neighborhood was not enough. She had learned this not in a classroom, but through life, through the small daily humiliations that accumulate in silence over the years and shape the way a black person learns to move through the world. She had built her career with an almost stubborn discipline, spent years studying real estate law, built a solid reputation, and bought her home in that neighborhood not by chance, but because she had worked for it with a determination that most people would never need to have. And yet, there she was, on the sidewalk, being questioned. The neighbor who approached that morning was named Susan. She had lived in the neighborhood for several years and had apparently developed over that time a kind of ownership over the surrounding space. The territorial comfort that certain people build without ever realizing it rests on the assumption that some people belong and others do not. Susan was not, at least on the surface, what most people would picture when they think of someone racist. She did not shout. She did not use slurs. She simply walked up to a neighbor who was checking her mail and began asking questions in a tone that made clear these were not real questions at all. They were demands dressed up as curiosity. What makes this kind of situation so devastating is not obvious violence. It is exactly the opposite. It is the way everything unfolds in a controlled tone of voice, in language that sounds reasonable on the surface, but carries underneath it an absolutely clear message. Prove that you have the right to be here. This dynamic has a name. Researchers and behavioral specialists call it everyday racism or microaggression. But the technical term fails to capture the real weight of what it is to be on the receiving end of that experience. It is not micro for the person living it. It is exhausting. It is humiliating. And it happens with a frequency that people who have never experienced it simply cannot imagine. Diana stood there listening to Susan's questions with a calm that anyone who knew her would understand came at a cost. She was a lawyer. She spent her days navigating conflicts, negotiations, situations where keeping composure was the difference between winning and losing. But there is an enormous difference between maintaining composure in a conference room or a courtroom and maintaining composure when someone is treating you like an intruder in the place where you sleep, where you keep your things, where you have the absolute legal right to be. Even so, she did not lose control. She responded. She explained. And at some point during that exchange, she did something Susan certainly did not expect. She made it clear that she knew exactly what her rights were. Have you ever stopped to think about how many times a day black people have to make that calculation? How far do I go? How much do I explain? When do I stop justifying myself? It is not a simple decision. There are consequences in every direction you choose. If you back down, the situation repeats itself because it went unpunished. If you respond too firmly, you become the problem. If you draw attention to the injustice, you are told you are overreacting, that you are being sensitive, that you are seeing racism where none exists. It is a trap designed to have no exit, and Diana knew every corner of it. What Susan had not calculated, not for a single moment as she stood there with her arms crossed, asking her questions on that October morning, was that the security camera positioned near the mailboxes was capturing everything. Every second of that interaction was being recorded with the date and time stamped in the upper right corner of the frame. And what the camera showed was not an ambiguous situation open to interpretation. What it showed was one woman approaching another in a shared public space, with no legitimate reason, with body language that told a very specific story about what she truly thought about having Diana as a neighbor. That footage was about to become the center of everything. When Diana walked back into her house that morning, she did not go straight to the kitchen to make coffee or turn on the television the way she would have on any other normal Saturday. She sat down. She was quiet for a moment. And then she began to process what had just happened with the analytical mind of someone who spends their professional life dismantling situations and identifying what is truly at stake. She knew that what Susan had done was not just unpleasant, it was potentially illegal, and she knew, with the precision of someone who understands the law from the inside, exactly which paths were available to her in that moment. The first step was to check the security cameras. The neighborhood had a monitoring system in common areas, including the mailbox area, and Diana knew this. She had noticed the cameras before, the way people who pay attention to their surroundings tend to notice these things. When she confirmed that the camera was positioned directly over the location where the conversation had taken place, she understood that she had something concrete. It was not just her word against Susan's word. There was a recording. There was an objective record of that moment, with date, time, and image clear enough to show exactly what had happened and how it had happened. Getting access to that recording was not immediate. It involved contacting the neighborhood association, making a formal request, and navigating the bureaucracy those requests typically entail. But Diana was a lawyer. She knew how to make formal requests. She knew what her rights were as a resident regarding access to recordings from common areas. And she knew that every hour that passed without that file being preserved was an hour in which it could be overwritten or deleted by the system's automatic rotation. She acted with urgency, but with method. No agitation, no confrontation, just the quiet efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. While she waited for the footage, Diana began documenting everything she could. She wrote a detailed account of the conversation, while the memories were still fresh, noting not just what was said, but the tone, the posture, the sequence of events. She photographed the mailbox area. She identified which neighbors might have seen or heard anything. This documentation process might seem excessive to anyone who has never had to prove they were the victim of something that leaves no physical marks. But Diana understood that in situations like this one, where discrimination happens in carefully controlled language and without obvious witnesses, the difference between being able to hold someone accountable or not almost always comes down to the details most people dismiss as irrelevant. The video arrived, and when Diana watched that footage for the first time, sitting in front of her computer with the file finally open on the screen, what she saw confirmed everything she had felt on that sidewalk. The camera had captured Susan's approach with unsettling clarity. You could see the body language, the crossed arms, the expression on her face, the way Susan had positioned herself in relation to Diana in a manner that anyone watching would recognize as confrontational. There was no ambiguity in those images. There was no way to watch that video and conclude that what was taking place was a friendly conversation between neighbors. What was happening there was an interrogation, and the reason for that interrogation was implicit in every second of the recording. Diana sent the video to several professional colleagues that same evening, not to ask for their opinion about what had happened. She already knew what had happened, but to assess, with other trained eyes, what the smartest strategy would be from that point forward. The responses were unanimous. What the footage showed was sufficient to support a formal complaint with the Neighborhood Association for Racial Discrimination, and possibly far more than that. One colleague who watched the video said something that stayed with Diana for days, that Susan had made the classic mistake of people who act on prejudice and have never been held accountable before. She had acted as though there would be no consequences, as though no one was watching, as though the entire world could not see. The formal complaint was filed on a Monday morning, 2 days after the incident. Diana arrived at the Neighborhood Association's management office with a carefully drafted document, the detailed account she had written on Saturday, and a preserved copy of the recording. The person who received her on the other side of the counter clearly had not expected that level of preparation. They had not expected precise legal language, had not expected specific references to the clauses in the neighborhood's internal regulations, prohibiting discrimination among residents, and had definitely not expected the woman sitting across from them to know exactly what the management's legal obligations were from the moment a formal complaint was registered. The meeting was brief, the complaint was accepted, and the clock began to run. The Neighborhood Association contacted Susan that same week. What was said in that conversation was never fully disclosed, but the result was clear. Susan received a formal notification informing her that a complaint had been filed against her for discriminatory conduct, and that the association was obligated to investigate. For Susan, this was likely the first moment in which the seriousness of what she had done began to take any concrete form. Until then, from her perspective, what had happened on that sidewalk was simply a conversation between neighbors. Perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps misinterpreted, but not something with real consequences. The formal notification was the first indication that she had miscalculated badly. Susan hired a lawyer. This detail matters because it reveals something about how she interpreted the situation. She did not go to Diana to apologize. She did not go to the neighborhood association to try to resolve the misunderstanding, as she surely would have called it had she had that conversation. She went directly to a lawyer, which means that on some level, she knew she had done something that required a defense. Her attorney began constructing the narrative that was predictable from the start, that Susan was simply being a good neighbor, concerned about the safety of the community, that there had been no discriminatory intent, that everything had been misinterpreted by Diana, and that the formal complaint was a disproportionate reaction to a completely ordinary situation. That defense narrative, the one about the concerned neighbor looking out for community safety, is one of the oldest and most commonly used in cases of racial discrimination in residential communities. It works because it sounds reasonable on the surface. Who could be against neighbors who care about the safety of the place where they live? The problem is that it collapses completely when you ask the right questions. Why was Diana specifically approached and not other residents who were in the area at the same time? Why was the approach immediately confrontational rather than friendly? Why had Susan never approached Diana in this way? Before, during the weeks the two had coexisted in the neighborhood without incident? And most importantly, why was the body language captured in the recording consistent with suspicion and hostility rather than genuine concern? Diana's attorney responded to the defense narrative with something far more powerful than counter-arguments. With evidence. The footage was analyzed frame by frame. Experts in nonverbal behavior were consulted to technically document what anyone watching the video already perceived intuitively. The history of the neighborhood association was researched for other similar incidents, other complaints, other patterns that could contextualize what had happened to Diana, not as an isolated event, but as part of something larger. Every piece of information that Susan's defense presented was found, examined, and answered with surgical precision. Diana was not merely reacting, she was building a case. What was becoming increasingly evident as the process moved forward was that Susan had underestimated Diana in a way that went far beyond that Saturday morning. She had underestimated her knowledge, her determination, and her capacity to transform that humiliating experience into a legal battle that Susan was simply not equipped to win. There is a particular cruelty in discriminating against someone who has dedicated their professional life to understanding and defending the very rights being violated in that exact moment. Susan had chosen, for reasons only she could explain, to confront precisely the wrong person. And now, the consequences of that choice were beginning to take shape in a way that neither of them could ignore. The legal process that followed lasted months, and during those months Susan's life continued apparently normal on the outside, while on the inside it was being systematically dismantled by a body of evidence she had no way to refute. Her attorney did what defense lawyers do in these cases, tried to create doubt, tried to recontextualize what the camera had shown, tried to convince the parties involved that all of this was a monumental exaggeration about a trivial conversation between neighbors. But there is a very clear limit to what arguments can accomplish when a high-definition recording exists, showing exactly the opposite of what the defense is trying to sustain. The recording was the center of everything throughout the entire process. It was formally presented, analyzed by experts, and displayed in contexts that Susan had certainly never imagined when she stood there with her arms crossed on that October morning. Every frame of that video told a story that required no narration. The way Susan had approached, the posture she had maintained throughout the conversation, the expression she wore on her face while Diana answered her questions with the exhausted calm of someone who had been through this before. All of it was there, digitally preserved, irrefutable. And the more Susan's attorney tried to find a way to reinterpret those images, the more evident it became that no reinterpretation was possible. What the process also began to reveal, as it moved forward, was a history that made the incident even less isolated than it had already seemed. Other residents of the neighborhood, most of them black or from other minorities, began sharing their own experiences. None of them had ever filed a formal complaint, for reasons that anyone who understands how these dynamics work recognizes immediately. The fear of not being believed, the exhaustion of having to repeatedly prove what you know happened, the feeling that the system was not built to protect you. But when Diana opened that space by filing her complaint and making the process visible, those stories began to emerge, and they painted a picture far broader than a single incident on a Saturday morning. The neighborhood association, which had initially treated Diana's complaint as a bureaucratic problem to be managed, began to realize it was sitting on top of something potentially far more serious. A documented pattern of racial discrimination in the common areas of a residential community is not merely a neighbor relations problem. It is a legal liability. It is the kind of thing that results in lawsuits not just against the individual who practiced the discrimination, but against the entity that manages the space where it happened and that failed to create a safe and equal environment for all its residents. Diana's attorney had made this very clear from the beginning, and now the association was finally taking it seriously. Susan received a settlement offer several weeks before. The case was set to go to trial. The initial figures were rejected by Diana, who was not conducting this process in search of whatever amount would make the problem quietly disappear. She was looking for a number that reflected the true gravity of what had happened, that acknowledged the harm caused, and that was high enough to mean something beyond a passing financial inconvenience. The negotiations were tense. Susan and her attorney repeatedly tried to frame the agreement as an honorable exit for both parties, as though Diana were doing her a favor by agreeing to close the case without going to trial. Diana did not see it that way, and her attorney was absolutely clear about what would happen if the case reached a jury with that recording as the primary evidence. The final number was $50,000. $50,000 that Susan would have to pay Diana as formal acknowledgement of the harm caused by her conduct on that October morning. But the agreement included more than money. It included a series of conditions related to Susan's future behavior within the neighborhood, obligations to participate in racial discrimination awareness programs, and clauses that made any future incident substantially more costly from a legal standpoint. The money was important. The conditions were even more important, because Diana's goal had never been simply to be compensated for what she had suffered. It was to ensure it would not happen again. The agreement was signed on an afternoon in March, 5 months after that October morning, at the mailboxes. Diana was in her attorney's office when she put pen to paper, and the people in the room described the moment as surprisingly quiet. There was no celebration, no dramatic relief, none of those cathartic moments that movies teach you to expect when justice finally happens. There was only the quiet weight of a long process coming to an end, and the awareness that no amount of money and no contractual clause completely erases what was done on that sidewalk on a Saturday morning. Diana gave an interview a few weeks after the agreement was finalized. She spoke with the same calm she had demonstrated throughout the entire process, the same calm that was recorded in that mailbox video, and said something that summarized with precision what had motivated her to see it through to the end. She said that she knew, from the moment she walked back into her house that Saturday, that if she did nothing, Susan would continue doing the same thing to other residents. To people who would not know there was a camera, to people who would not know what their rights were, to people who would not have the resources or the knowledge to fight back. She had fought not just for herself, but for every one of those people the system leaves without options. The video had already circulated among resident groups and civil rights attorneys before the agreement was even finalized. After the outcome became public, it began spreading in a broader way. People shared it not just out of outrage over what Susan had done, but because of what Diana had done in response. The way she had documented everything immediately, preserved the recording, filed the formal complaint, built the case with methodology and patience, and refused insufficient settlement offers until she achieved a result that truly meant something. She had transformed a humiliating experience into a manual for how to defend yourself when the system tends to protect the one who did wrong. Susan virtually disappeared from the social life of the neighborhood after the agreement was signed. Some neighbors reported that she had drastically reduced her interactions with other residents, that she rarely appeared in common areas, and that when she did, she avoided any contact with Diana. Whether she had genuinely reflected on what she had done or had simply learned to be more careful is impossible to know. What can be said with certainty is that the entire neighborhood had changed after that process. The association had revised its internal policies. The residents who had shared their own experiences during the investigation had finally seen their stories taken seriously. And there was a camera at the mailboxes that everyone now knew was recording. There is something deeply revealing in the way this case unfolded from the standpoint of what it says about power and about who has access to it. Susan had acted the Way she did because, on some level, she believed she could. Because people in positions like hers generally can and usually face no real consequences. What she had not calculated was the specific combination of factors that made this case different. A camera in the right place, a victim with specialized legal knowledge, and a determination that did not yield when the system offered the easy exit of an insufficient settlement. Remove any one of those elements, and the outcome would likely have been completely different. That is the most uncomfortable part of this entire story. Because the truth this case leaves hanging in the air, after the money was paid and the documents were signed and everyone's lives moved forward, is that justice should not depend on a camera being in the right place. It should not depend on the victim being a specialist attorney in precisely the relevant field. It should not require months of legal proceedings, considerable financial resources, and an extraordinary determination from someone who had already been humiliated enough. It should be accessible to any person who wakes up on a Saturday morning, goes to get their mail, and is treated as though they do not belong in the place where they live. Diana achieved justice. But she was the first to say that the fact that she achieved it does not mean the system is working. It means only that this time, with this unique combination of circumstances, it did not manage to fail.
Turn that damn camera off right now and show me some ID.
The camera stays on and I need to know why you stopped me first.
I don't need a reason to stop anyone in this neighborhood, sweetheart.
Actually, you need reasonable suspicion under the Fourth Amendment.
But don't get smart with me. I've been doing this since before you were...
It was a Sunday morning, and Dominique Perryman was on her way to church. She had woken up earlier than usual, had spent extra time getting ready, was wearing her best dress, and had left home with enough time to arrive before the service began. It was the kind of morning that should have had no story to tell. The kind of morning that passes and fades into memory as just another ordinary Sunday. But when she turned the corner of the street where she had lived for the past 6 years and saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, something in her stomach recognized it before her brain had time to process it. She pulled over. She lowered the window, and what appeared on the other side of that window was a white police officer with the expression of someone who had already decided how that conversation was going to end before it had even begun. What followed over the next 23 minutes was captured in full by Dominique's phone, which she had discreetly positioned on the dashboard before the officer reached the window. She knew how to do that, not because she was an activist, not because she had a history of conflicts with police, but because she was a second-grade detective with the Franklin County Police Department in Ohio, with 12 years of service, a specialization in crimes against persons, and a record that included more than 140 successful arrests over the previous 3 years. She knew traffic stop protocols better than most academy instructors. She knew exactly what an officer should and should not do in that type of situation. And within the first 30 seconds of that stop, she already knew that what was happening had nothing to do with traffic. The image the video captured, a uniformed officer leaning over her car window, hand positioned near the equipment on his belt, mouth open in a tone that was not a question, but an imposition, circulated across the country in the weeks that followed. But before arriving at the moment when that video became central evidence in a federal criminal case, there is a story that needs to be told from the beginning. About who that officer was, what he had done before that Sunday morning, and why the system that should have contained him had failed repeatedly for years before Dominique Perryman crossed his path. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly. Subscribe to the channel right now and drop a comment with one word that describes what you feel when you watch a video like this. It doesn't need to be elaborate. One word is enough, because stories like this exist in a space where it is very easy to consume and move on, and what I want is for you to stay, to follow through to the end. Because this particular case has an outcome that most stories like this never have, and you need to see how it got there. The officer who appears in that video was named Craig Welton. He had 14 years in the Reynoldsburg Police Department, a mid-size city in the metropolitan area of Columbus, Ohio. 14 years is enough time to build a career, to earn institutional respect, to accumulate the kind of internal political capital that protects an officer when complaints arrive. And the complaints had arrived. Not one, not two. Public records obtained during the legal process that followed the incident with Dominique revealed that Welton had accumulated 11 formal complaints over the course of his career, 7 of which involved allegations of racially discriminatory behavior during traffic stops. Of the 11, 2 had resulted in verbal warnings. The other 9 had been internally archived with no disciplinary action. Welton had learned, over 14 years, that there was a very high ceiling for what he could do without real consequences. That Sunday morning, he discovered the ceiling had disappeared. The neighborhood where Dominique was stopped was the same one where she lived, where she shopped, where she dropped her children off at school during the week. It was a neighborhood she knew by heart, where neighbors knew her by name, where she had built an entire life. There was nothing unusual about the way she was driving, the condition of her vehicle, her speed, or the lane she was in. The dash cam footage shows this clearly. The camera records completely normal, driving in the seconds before Welton's lights appear in the rearview mirror. There was no infraction. There was no legitimate pretext. There was a police officer who saw a car being driven by a black woman in a neighborhood he had patrolled for years, and decided that was reason enough to act. Craig Welton had arrived at work that Sunday morning 40 minutes early. That detail, apparently irrelevant, came to light during subsequent investigations and was cited by forensic psychologists hired by the prosecution as part of a behavioral pattern that had been documented in previous incidents. Welton had a habit of arriving early on days when he was in the mood to create problems. That was how colleagues who later testified against him described it, with the uncomfortable precision of people who had observed something for years without having the right words to name it. He would arrive early, take the patrol car alone, and head out into the neighborhood with an energy that others had learned to recognize. It was not professional enthusiasm. It was something else. It was the particular disposition of someone who was looking for a specific situation and knew it was only a matter of time before finding it. He had made 3 other stops that morning before pulling over. Dominique's car. Dispatch system records showed this with time-stamp precision. The first had been a black man driving a pickup truck toward the city's commercial district. Welton had stopped him, spent 19 minutes asking questions without issuing any infraction, and released him with no formal record. The second had been a Latina woman in a vehicle with an out-of-county plate. Same dynamic. Prolonged stop, questions with no apparent foundation, release with no documented infraction. The third had been a young black man on a bicycle, stopped on the shoulder of a road where cyclists had every right to be. Welton had stayed with him for 11 minutes before moving on. 3 stops in less than 2 hours, 3 people of color, no documented infraction in any of them. When Dominique's attorneys presented these records during the proceedings, the federal prosecutor described that morning as a pattern of hunting, not patrolling. When Welton's lights appeared in Dominique's rear view mirror, she did what any person trained in stop procedures would do. She pulled over immediately, in a well-lit location, with enough space for the officer to approach safely. There was no hesitation, no evasive maneuver, nothing that could be interpreted as lack of cooperation. She placed her hands visibly on the steering wheel and waited. In the interval between pulling over and the officer reaching the window, which lasted approximately 45 seconds, she picked up her phone from the cup holder with a deliberate movement and rested it on the dashboard, camera facing the driver's window. It was not the first time she had done this. It was a personal protocol she had developed over years, not out of paranoia, but for the same reason any law enforcement professional documents potentially problematic interactions. Because evidence is the difference between what happened and what someone decides to say happened. Welton arrived at the window with the posture the video captured, and that became the image most associated with the case in the weeks that followed. Body leaning over the window opening, right hand resting on the equipment on his belt, expression that mixed performative authority with something that people who analyzed the video described consistently as contempt. He did not introduce himself. He did not state the reason for the stop, which is basic mandatory protocol in virtually every police department in the country. He did not ask if Dominique was all right. He immediately began asking questions about where she was going, where she had come from, whether the car was hers, whether she had been drinking. It was a sequence of questions that corresponded to no known traffic infraction. You do not ask someone if they have been drinking at 9:30 on a Sunday morning without any observational basis for it, such as erratic driving behavior or the smell of alcohol. It was a fishing expedition, an attempt to find something during this conversation that would retroactively justify the stop that had already happened without justification. Dominique answered each question with precision and economy of words. She was going to church. She had left from home on the parallel street. The car was hers, registered in her name. She had not consumed alcohol. Her answers gave Welton nothing to work with, and the video captures the moment he realizes this. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds where he looks into the car, then at the document Dominique had handed over, then back at her, as if recalculating. It was in that pause that he committed the first serious legal mistake. He said, with his body camera running and Dominique's phone recording, that he had stopped her car because she did not look like she belonged in that neighborhood. He did not say there had been an infraction. He did not say driving behavior had generated suspicion. He said she did not look like she belonged there, in a neighborhood where she had lived for 6 years, on a street less than 1 kilometer from her own home. Dominique's expression at the moment. Welton said, that is one of the most discussed elements by those who analyze the video in detail. There was no explosion, no visible emotional reaction. Nothing Welton could use to escalate the situation. There was a very slight shift in posture, almost imperceptible, the kind that happens when a person who already suspected something receives confirmation that their suspicion was correct. She had entered that stop as a detective, and she had just received, from the officer's own mouth with the camera running, the evidence that made the case legally incontestable before it had even ended. What happened in the minutes following that statement, the statement about her not looking like she belonged in the neighborhood, was where the stop crossed from administrative misconduct into criminal territory. Welton did not back down. He either did not grasp the weight of what he had said, or if he did, he calculated that there were not enough consequences to justify changing course. He ordered Dominique to step out of the car. There was no legal foundation for that. An order to exit the vehicle during a traffic stop requires the officer to have reasonable suspicion that there is a danger to their safety, or that there is evidence of a crime inside the vehicle. There was neither. The video itself documented that. Dominique was cooperative, hands visible, with no behavior that could be interpreted as a threat. Welton asked her to get out because it was the next step in the escalation he had initiated, not because there was any legal justification for the request. Dominique got out of the car. She made that decision consciously and deliberately, not because she was required to, but because she knew every second of that interaction was being recorded, and that her documented cooperation would make each of Welton's actions even more indefensible in the legal process she was already mentally constructing as it happened. When she stepped out of the vehicle, Welton instructed her to face the car with her hands resting on the hood. It was a search position, the kind of positioning used when there is suspicion that a person is armed or represents an immediate danger. Dominique Perryman was wearing a Sunday dress on her way to church. There was absolutely nothing in that scene that justified that positioning, but she complied. She faced her own car, hands on the hood, on a Sunday morning, on the street where she lived, being treated as a suspect for something Welton was unable to name because it did not exist. It was at that moment that one of Dominique's neighbors, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, stepped out of her house to put something in the mailbox and saw the scene. Patricia was 63 years old, had lived on that street for 21 years, and had known Dominique since she had moved into the neighborhood. She stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds processing what she was seeing. The neighbors she knew by name, whose children she had watched grow up, standing facing her own car with her hands on the hood, while a police officer circled around her. Patricia went back inside immediately and picked up her own phone. She did not call the emergency number. She called directly to the non-emergency line of the police department and reported what she was witnessing, a woman being detained without apparent reason in front of her own home. That call was logged with a timestamp and later became part of the body of evidence in the case. Welton spent the next 7 minutes circling around Dominique's car, looking through the windows, opening and closing the trunk, with the permission she had tacitly granted by stepping out of the vehicle without protest. Another element that defense attorneys would later attempt to use, and that Dominique's attorneys neutralized by arguing that cooperation under coercion does not constitute legal consent. He found nothing. Of course he did not, because there was nothing to find. The car was clean, registered, insured, with no irregularity of any kind. When Welton finished circling the vehicle and returned to where Dominique was standing, the video captures a moment that prosecutors would later cite repeatedly in hearings as the point where administrative misconduct definitively became a crime. Welton grabbed Dominique's wrist with his hand, without warning, without justification, without any context that made that physical contact legally defensible, and repositioned her so that she was facing sideways relative to the car. It was assault. Simple, documented, indefensible. Dominique did not react physically. The restraint she demonstrated in that moment, watching the video, is of a quality that goes beyond training. It is the kind of control that comes from understanding, at a visceral level, that any physical reaction on her part in that moment, however justified, would be used to reframe the entire narrative. She stayed still, she breathed, and she said in a calm voice fully audible on the recording that he had just committed physical assault against a detective from the county police department and that the video had recorded everything. Welton stepped back one pace. His body camera recorded the moment. Dominique's phone on the dashboard recorded the moment. And Patricia Okonkwo, from the sidewalk across the street, was recording too. What happened immediately after Dominique's words was as revealing as everything that had come before. Welton did not apologize. He did not end the stop. He did not call for supervision. He stood, in silence for a few seconds, then returned to Dominique's car window, picked up the driver's license that had remained on the seat, handed it back to her, and said she was free to go. No explanation, no formal record of the stop, no document indicating that contact had occurred at all. It was as though he expected Dominique to simply take the license, get in the car, and drive away, that the implicit threat of everything that had happened in the last 23 minutes would be enough to ensure her silence. It was the same bet he had made 11 times before, with 11 complaints that had been filed away without consequences. It was a bet he had won 11 times. This time, he had lost before he even knew he was playing. Dominique Perryman did not go to church that Sunday. She got in the car, waited for Welton to move away, and sat there for a few minutes with the engine running and her hands on the steering wheel. Not because she was in collapse. She would describe that moment later in interviews as a period of deliberate organization, not emotional paralysis. She was taking inventory, mentally checking every element of what had happened, every word that had been said, every action that had been taken, in the exact order in which it had occurred, with the precision of an investigator who knew that the quality of immediate memory was a resource that degraded with time and needed to be preserved while it was still sharp. When she finished that process, she picked up the phone from the dashboard, verified that the recording was intact, saved the file in 3 different locations, and sent a text message to her direct supervisor's personal number. The message had 4 words: "I need to talk now." Dominique's supervisor was Detective Chief Marcus Alley, a man with 26 years of service who had supervised Dominique for the previous 4 years and who, by all available accounts, held for her the kind of professional respect that is built over years of working together on difficult cases. He called back in less than 3 minutes. Dominique described what had happened with the same precision she had used to organize the information in her own mind. Chronological, factual, without emotional embellishments that could be used to question the objectivity of the account. When she finished, Allie was silent for a moment. Then he said she should come directly to the department, not touch anything in the car, and that he would be there when she arrived. He also said something that Dominique repeated in every interview she gave about the case. He said this was not going to disappear and that he was going to personally make sure of that. Dominique's arrival at the department that afternoon triggered a series of procedures that the Reynoldsburg Police Department had clearly not anticipated when Craig Welton went out to patrol that morning. Because Dominique was not merely a victim with a video, she was a colleague within the same system, a detective from another department who had been stopped, humiliated, and physically assaulted by an officer while she was off duty and on her way to church. That created an institutional problem of a completely different nature from an ordinary civil complaint. There were implications for interdepartmental relations. There was the question of the credibility of testimony from a witness who was herself a law enforcement officer. And there was the video, which Marcus Alley watched 3 times in a row in a closed room before saying anything to anyone. What Alley did next was what defined the trajectory of the case in a way that Welton and the Reynoldsburg department could not have anticipated. Rather than routing the complaint through normal internal channels, the same channels that had archived 11 previous complaints against Welton without consequences, Alley went directly to the Franklin County Prosecutor's office. Not a phone call. He went in person, that same Sunday afternoon, with a copy of the video on a USB drive and a 3-page written account that Dominique had dictated while he wrote, The on-call prosecutor who received him was a woman named Andrea Voss, who had 15 years of experience in crimes against persons and who, according to accounts from those present, watched the video once, closed the laptop, and asked Allie whether the victim was willing to cooperate fully with a criminal investigation. When Allie said yes, Voss said she would open a formal investigation the following morning. The investigation that followed lasted 6 weeks and was conducted with a level of secrecy that the Reynoldsburg Department itself was not informed of its existence until it was already at an advanced stage. This was deliberate. One of the prosecution's first decisions had been not to notify Welton's department until the evidence was completely preserved and the initial testimonies collected, precisely to prevent any internal institutional protection process from interfering with the evidentiary material. Investigators from the prosecutor's office obtained the body camera recordings from Welton's other 3 stops that morning, the ones that had preceded the stop of Dominique. They obtained dispatch records showing the pattern of stops without documented infractions. They collected testimony from 4 of Welton's colleagues who, when confronted with the evidence and informed they were under legal obligation to respond truthfully, provided accounts that painted a consistent portrait of an officer whose behavior had been problematic for years and whose complaints had been systematically minimized by a supervisory chain that prioritized internal cohesion over accountability. The most devastating testimony did not come from a colleague of Welton's or from one of the previous victims the investigators had managed to locate. It came from Welton's own immediate supervisor, a sergeant named Donald Pruitt, who had signed off on the archiving of 6 of the 11 previous complaints. When confronted with the evidence and informed that the investigation had found documentation that he had been warned about Welton's behavior by other colleagues on at least 3 separate occasions before any formal complaint had been filed, Pruitt made a decision that his attorneys later described as the biggest mistake of his career. Instead of invoking his right to remain silent, he began to talk. And what he said over the following 2 hours not only confirmed the pattern of institutional protection the prosecution was trying to document, it provided details the prosecution had not yet found, and that expanded the scope of the investigation in a way no one had anticipated when everything had begun with a traffic stop on a Sunday morning. What Donald Pruitt revealed in those 2 hours of testimony transformed what had begun as an investigation of individual misconduct into an investigation of institutional conspiracy. He described an informal but deliberate system within the Reynoldsburg Police Department where complaints against certain officers, specifically officers with years of service, with established relationships with department leadership, and with the kind of case closure record that made their presence institutionally valuable, were managed in ways designed to minimize formal consequences. It was not a system written down anywhere. There were no memos, no explicit guidelines, nothing an external auditor could find in a document review. It was a culture transmitted through informal conversations, through verbal guidance on how to document complaints in ways that reduced their apparent severity, through decisions made in off-agenda meetings that left no trace in the department's official records. Pruitt described specifically 3 episodes involving Welton that he had personally handled. In the first, 2 years before the incident with Dominique, a black man had filed a formal complaint describing an almost identical stop, pulled over without infraction, kept for more than 20 minutes, subjected to baseless questions, and released without any record. The man had recorded part of the interaction on his phone, but the video quality was poor and the audio was partially inaudible. Pruitt admitted that he had advised the man during the complaint phase to consider whether he was certain of what he had seen, had suggested there might be a misunderstanding about police procedures, and had framed the complaint in the internal records in a way that classified it as a dispute of interpretation rather than an allegation of discrimination. The complaint had been archived within 3 weeks. In the second episode, 18 months before the incident with Dominique, a Latina woman had filed a complaint alleging that Welton had made comments about her appearance and origins during a traffic stop. There was a witness. The woman's teenage son had been in the passenger seat throughout the interaction. Pruitt had interviewed the boy separately from his mother, without the presence of an adult guardian other than the witness himself, which was a violation of departmental protocol for interviews with minors. During that interview, according to Pruitt himself in the deposition, he had framed the questions in a way that suggested the boy might be confusing the officer's tone with ordinary rudeness rather than intentional discrimination. The The complaint had been archived within 2 weeks. The third episode was the most serious of all and involved an allegation of disproportionate physical force that had been completely excluded from the department's formal records. Not archived as unfounded, but simply not recorded as having existed at all. Prosecutor Andrea Voss, upon receiving Pruitt's testimony, made a decision that expanded the scope of the charges in a way the Reynoldsburg Department had not anticipated when the case had begun. She added Pruitt as a secondary defendant in the criminal charges, not as a collaborative witness. And she based that decision on a legal doctrine that is rarely applied in police misconduct cases, but which, when applied, has devastating consequences for everyone involved. The doctrine of liability through deliberate omission, which establishes criminal responsibility for supervisors who, having knowledge of a pattern of criminal conduct by a subordinate, take active steps to prevent that pattern from being investigated or punished. It was not negligence, it was complicity. And Pruitt's 2 hours of testimony had provided the prosecution with exactly what it needed to sustain that argument before a jury. The formal charges against Craig Welton were filed 53 days after the incident in the Columbus residential neighborhood. There were 6 charges in total. Discriminatory stop with racial motivation, which was a crime under Ohio state legislation, reformed following a series of documented racial profiling cases in the state in previous years. Physical assault against a public safety officer, which carried an aggravating factor because Dominique was a law enforcement officer, even while off duty. Abuse of authority, falsification of public record, for the deliberate absence of any documentation of that stop in department records. Obstruction of justice related to the way Welton had attempted to end the interaction without leaving a trace after Dominique mentioned the video. And the 6th charge, the one that transformed the case from administrative to definitively and irreversibly criminal. Second-degree kidnapping, because detaining a person by force without legal cause constitutes unlawful deprivation of liberty under the Ohio Penal Code, regardless of how long the detention lasted. When the charges were made public, the Reynoldsburg Department issued a statement saying Welton had been suspended without pay pending the conclusion of the legal process. It was a late defensive response, accompanied by a series of statements from department attorneys, attempting to establish distance between the institution and the individual officer's actions. Exactly the kind of dissociation that Pruitt's inclusion as a defendant made legally unsustainable. Because if a supervisor had actively protected Welton from consequences for years, the institution could not claim that Welton's actions were individual and isolated. The chain of responsibility went up, and the prosecution was determined to follow that chain wherever it led. Craig Welton's trial began on a Monday in March, 8 months after that Sunday when he had stopped Dominique Perryman's car in a residential neighborhood of Columbus. The courtroom was full, not because there was a crowd of protesters or because the case had become a media spectacle in the most superficial sense of the word, but because there was an unusual number of people with a direct stake in the outcome. Previous victims the investigators had located, colleagues of Dominique from the Franklin County Department, representatives of civil rights organizations that had followed the case since the charges were made public, and a significant number of residents from the neighborhood where the stop had occurred, including Patricia Okonkwo, who had reserved a seat in the front row and who was present on each of the 11 days of trial without exception. Welton's defense strategy had been built on 3 pillars that his attorneys probably knew were fragile, but that were the only ones available given the quality of the evidence. The first pillar was to question the chain of custody of the recordings, to attempt to establish that there was a technical possibility that the video from Dominique's phone had been edited or manipulated between the moment of recording and the moment it was presented as evidence. That line of argument was destroyed in the second hearing, when the prosecution's technical experts presented forensic analysis of the video file that verified its integrity frame by frame, confirming there was no evidence of editing or manipulation of any kind. The second pillar was to argue that the order to exit the vehicle had been justified by security elements not visible in the video, but that Welton had perceived in person. That argument collapsed under cross-examination when the prosecuting attorney asked Welton specifically what security elements he had perceived, and the answers were so vague and internally inconsistent that the jury itself was observed exchanging glances during the testimony. The third pillar was the most desperate of the 3 and revealed just how short of real options the defense had run. Welton's attorneys attempted to argue that the physical contact, the assault for which he had been charged, had been an involuntary gesture, a positioning adjustment necessary for the safety of the procedure, not an intentional assault. That argument needed to survive the video. It did not. Prosecutor Andrea Voss, during closing arguments, paused the video on the exact frame in which Welton's hand grabbed Dominique's wrist, and left that image frozen on the screen for 27 seconds of complete silence before saying anything. When she spoke, she said only that the jury had seen what they had seen, that no verbal explanation could undo what was documented in that frame, and that the question before them was simple, whether that was, or was not, the definition of unprovoked physical assault against a citizen, who was cooperating fully with a stop that should never have happened. The jury deliberated for 2 days, not because there was doubt about the outcome, but because there were 6 separate charges, and the jury foreperson was a meticulous woman who insisted that each charge be analyzed individually with specific reference to the corresponding evidence before any vote was conducted. When they returned with the verdict, Craig Welton was found guilty on all 6 charges. The room fell silent for a moment after the foreperson finished reading. Then Patricia Okonkwo, in the front row, put her hand over her face, and Dominique, seated beside her attorneys, remained completely still for a few seconds before briefly closing her eyes and opening them again with the expression that people who were present later described not as relief, not as triumph, but as the face of someone who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had just been given permission to set it down. And sentence was handed down 6 weeks after the verdict. The judge who presided over the case was known for sentences that balanced punishment with proportionality, and there was a genuine expectation that Welton would receive something at the lower end of the range permitted by the charges. That expectation was quickly revised when the judge began reading the sentence. He spoke for 42 minutes before arriving at the number. He spoke about what the case represented in terms of abuse of public trust. He spoke about the pattern of 11 archived complaints and what that said about the institutional complicity that had allowed Welton to continue operating without consequences. He spoke about the specific impact on Dominique Perryman, not just the trauma of the incident itself, but what it means for a woman who dedicated her career to serving and protecting to be treated as a suspect by the very system to which she had devoted 12 years of her life. And then he arrived at the number. 5 years in state prison, with no possibility of early release in the first 30 months, followed by 3 years of supervised parole, immediate and permanent dismissal from the position, with irrevocable revocation of police certification in the state of Ohio. Donald Pruitt, prosecuted separately, received 18 months in prison and dismissal under the same conditions. Dominique Perryman gave a single press conference after the sentencing, outside the courthouse, with Marcus Alley by her side. She spoke for less than 5 minutes. There was no anger in those words, no performative victory, nothing that sounded like celebration of another person's suffering. There was clarity. She said there were 2 stories this case told simultaneously, and that it was important not to confuse one with the other. The first was the story of what had happened to her. A woman on her way to church on a Sunday, stopped without reason, humiliated on her own street, who had fought for what? Was right because she had the means to do so. The second was the story of all the people who had gone through something similar with Welton before her, whose complaints had been archived, whose names had never appeared in a newspaper headline, and who had not received any verdict in a courtroom that day. She said what had happened in that courtroom was justice for her, but that real justice meant the system that had protected Welton for 14 years should never function that way for anyone again. And that part, the systemic change, the real reform, the guarantee that the next 11 complaints would not be silently archived, that part had not yet happened. That part was still to come.
Fairness is an enduring mission, and insight serves as your safeguard. Thank you for watching and advocating for absolute clarity.